I never thought I'd be the guy to spill my guts on the internet, but I guess there's a first time for everything. I can't exactly talk to my friends about this. They'd either laugh it off or tell me I got what I deserved. And maybe I did, but I still need to talk about it because it was the craziest, scariest thing that's ever happened to me. It all started about 6 months ago. My wife, Rachel, and I had been married for nearly 2 years. Our relationship began like one of those romances you read about in novels. We met at a friend's party and quickly became inseparable. Rachel was full of life and passion, and she held deep religious beliefs that were a significant part of her identity right from the start. At first, her faith didn't seem like an issue. She went to church activities a couple of times a week, which I thought was great. It gave me some time to catch up on my own hobbies. But as months passed, her religious activities started to take over our lives. Our conversations, our plans, even our dinners began to revolve around her church. She had an answer for everything, and it always came back to her faith. I admired her conviction, but it was clear that her faith was her priority, and I felt more like a spectator than a partner. That's when I met Lisa at a work conference. She was everything my relationship with Rachel was no longer: light, easygoing, and fun. Lisa didn't care much about heavy topics or moral debates. She lived in the moment and brought me along for the ride. We started out as friends, but I was drawn to her simplicity and charm, and before I knew it, we were seeing each other outside of work. I told myself it was nothing serious, just a way to feel normal again. But as weeks turned into months, my casual meetups with Lisa became the highlights of my week. I knew I was walking a dangerous line, especially because Lisa had no idea I was married to Rachel, but I kept justifying it by telling myself that I was trapped in a marriage with someone who didn't even see me anymore, someone who was more married to her beliefs than to me. One night after a fun date, Lisa and I went back to her place. We had dinner, laughed, and danced a bit. By the time we got back to her apartment, things escalated, and we ended up in bed together. We were both exhausted afterward and just fell asleep. I woke up sometime past midnight, not sure what had woken me up, but I remember hearing something, like someone moving around in the dark. Still half asleep, I turned on the lamp, and there she was, Rachel, standing right next to the bed, staring down at us with wild, scary eyes. Her hair was messy, hanging all around her face. She was wearing a long, dark coat that made her look bigger and scarier than I remembered. She just stood there, staring intensely and breathing hard. It looked like she had been crying, but now she was really angry. The whole thing felt like a nightmare. "How could you do this?" she screamed, her voice raw and terrifying. "This is unholy! This is sin!" The intensity in her voice shook me to the core. I've never been so scared in my life. Lisa woke up screaming, and we both scrambled to cover ourselves. Rachel kept shouting about sin and punishment, and for a moment, I thought she might actually attack us. I jumped out of bed and stood between them, trying to calm Rachel down, but she was beyond reason. She slapped me hard across the face, then shoved me with a force I didn't know she had, sending me crashing into the nightstand. "You'll see. You'll all see the wrath that comes," she yelled as I finally managed to get her out the door and lock it. I was terrified. Lisa was crying. The night was a total nightmare. After that, Rachel left, still shouting from the hallway. I could hear her voice echoing down the stairwell, cursing and calling down divine retribution on us. Even after the door slammed shut, I could still hear her screams fading into the distance, leaving a heavy silence behind. Lisa was trembling, completely shaken up, and I wasn't much better. She looked at me, pale and scared, and asked in a shaky voice who that crazy woman was. I knew I couldn't hide it anymore. I had to come clean. I told her everything, that Rachel was my wife, that I'd been lying to her, and that Rachel had no idea I was seeing someone else. The shock hit Lisa hard. She stared at me, her expression a mix of disbelief, betrayal, and fear. Without saying another word, she quickly grabbed her stuff, her hands shaking as she gathered her things. I tried to explain, to make her understand, but she was already out the door before I could finish. I was left standing there, alone, with the weight of everything crashing down on me. I called Rachel the next day to try and explain what had happened, even though I knew there was no real excuse for what I did. It went straight to voicemail. I tried texting, but got nothing back. I even drove by her place, but there was no sign of her. It was like she just vanished after that night. I asked some of her friends and people from her church, but no one knew where she was or what had happened to her. When I finally got the courage to go back to my apartment, I found a cross nailed to my front door. No note, nothing, just the cross, right there. I took it down, but the message was clear. It's been a few weeks, and I haven't heard anything from Rachel. Lisa broke up with me not long after the incident. She couldn't handle the fear and the lies. My life's been falling apart since then. I lost my job because I couldn't focus, always looking over my shoulder, waiting for Rachel or something worse to happen. Then, one night, my phone rang in the middle of the night. It was one of my neighbors, sounding uneasy. They asked, "Hey, is everything okay? I think I just saw Rachel standing across the street from your building. She's just staring up at your apartment. Is something wrong?" I jumped out of bed, heart racing, and rushed to the window. But when I looked outside, the street was empty. No sign of Rachel. I asked my neighbor if they were sure, and they insisted that she had been there, standing completely still, just watching my apartment. They even described the coat she was wearing, the same long, dark coat she had on the night she confronted Lisa and me. I couldn't calm down after that. The idea of Rachel silently watching me sent a chill down my spine. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I kept pacing, expecting her to come back. What's worse is that Lisa isn't answering my calls or texts. I've tried reaching out, but it's like she disappeared too. I even went by her apartment, but no one has seen her for days. At first, I thought she was just avoiding me, trying to distance herself from everything. But now, I'm starting to worry. It feels like both of them are gone, but at the same time I can't shake the feeling that Rachel is still here, haunting me. Her stuff is still in the apartment, untouched, like she's planning to come back. Every time I walk by her things, it feels like she's waiting to pick up where she left off. I'm trapped in this mess, and the worst part is, I don't know if I'll ever feel safe again. I was 20 back then and still living with my parents, not exactly by choice, but I didn't have much of an option. I didn't work and they covered all my expenses. When my parents told me they'd be out of town for a whole week, I was honestly pretty excited. It was my first time alone at home, and a full week of freedom sounded perfect. No rules, no mom nagging me about my attitude or my carelessness. I thought it was going to be awesome. My mom is ridiculously strict though. Before she left, she gave me this epic list of chores, almost like she was mapping out my whole week in advance. She had every single day planned down to the smallest detail. No slacking off, she warned me with that classic mom look, half threatening and half disappointed. She was like, "I don't want to find anything out of place when I come back. I'll know if you haven't kept up." She was serious and annoying as hell. There wasn't much I could do about it anyway. She wasn't even out the door yet, and I was already rolling my eyes. At first, I was loving being alone. I had the entire house to myself, and I could eat all the junk food I wanted without anyone giving me looks. I stayed up late watching whatever I felt like, blasted my music as loud as I wanted. It was total freedom. And honestly, I was keeping up with my mom's chore list just to prove her wrong, to show her that, yeah, I could handle things without her watching me 24/7. It felt great. For a while anyway. By day 4, the excitement of having the house to myself was wearing off. The silence was starting to get to me. Without my mom's nagging or my dad's background noise, the quiet felt so heavy. I kept doing the usual chores, dusting, vacuuming, tidying up, but it all felt dull, like I was on autopilot. By day 5, I couldn't deny it. I was actually lonely, and as much as I hated to admit it, I missed having people around, especially my mom. One night, just as I was about to fall asleep, I heard a noise that jolted me wide awake. At first, I thought I was just being paranoid, but then I heard it again. Soft, shuffling noises coming from somewhere outside my bedroom door. I couldn't pinpoint exactly where it was. It might have been in the hallway or even downstairs, but one thing was for sure. It was definitely inside the house. It freaked the hell out of me, and I lay there for what felt like forever, completely still, my heart pounding as I listened carefully. Every little noise felt amplified in the silence. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I kept telling myself it was probably nothing, just my mind playing tricks on me. But I knew I wouldn't be able to sleep until I checked. So I got out of bed, every nerve on edge, and crept toward the door. I just needed to shake this paranoid feeling, to prove to myself that there was nothing there. I turned on the hallway light and leaned over the railing to see downstairs. And that's when I saw a huge man, dressed in all black, standing right in the living room. He was holding our TV, like he was actually planning to carry it out of the house. All the wires were already disconnected, and he had the entire thing balanced in his hands. For a second he froze, caught in the act, and we just stared at each other. I couldn't believe his nerve, to be taking a giant TV while I was home. Then he dropped the TV with a loud thud and bolted toward the stairs, coming right at me. My heart stopped. I bolted back to my room, slammed the door, and locked it, my hands shaking so hard I could barely turn the lock. I could hear him coming up the stairs, footsteps heavy and determined. The next thing I knew, he was pounding on my door, rattling the handle, trying to break it down. Panicked, I grabbed my phone and called my mom, barely able to get the words out as I cried, and told her that there's someone in the house. She was just as panicked, but she told me to block the door with whatever I could, and that she'd call the police right away. I pushed my dresser against the door, every second feeling like it could be my last, just hoping he wouldn't get through before help arrived. The banging on my door was relentless, each slam shaking the whole frame. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it would burst. Desperate, I yelled that I'd called the police and they were on their way, hoping it would scare him off. Then, all of a sudden, the banging just stopped and a deafening silence followed. For a second, I wasn't sure if he'd actually left, or if he was just waiting. The police arrived not long after, their lights flashing outside as I finally let out the breath I'd been holding. They came inside, checked the house, and told me it was probably a random break-in. The guy had managed to steal the TV, which was apparently the most expensive thing in the living room, and broken the front door lock on his way in. My parents showed up close to midnight, completely panicked. They'd been rushing home ever since I called. Seeing them felt like a huge relief, but I was still shaken, replaying everything in my head. The police reassured us, but all I could think about was that man holding the TV in his hands, and the fact that he was willing to come after me while I was alone in the house. After years of planning, saving, and working hard, my husband and I finally landed a home in this quiet, upscale neighborhood. It's the kind of place where the lawns are always perfectly trimmed, the air feels calm, and neighbors greet each other with these polite nods and smiles. This wasn't just another move. It felt like proof that all the years of work and sacrifice had finally paid off, like we'd actually made it. I moved in a day before my husband since he was still finishing up a few things at our old place. I'd been super meticulous about getting everything set up here, even hired a cleaning service to come through and make sure it was spotless. When I finally pulled up to the driveway, everything looked perfect, and I had this crazy sense of satisfaction seeing it all come together. In the afternoon, I went outside to introduce myself to a few neighbors I saw around. They were polite and welcoming, telling me how quiet and safe the area was. Apparently, it's the kind of place where everyone looks out for each other. By evening, I was starting to settle in, unpacking little things here and there, making the place feel like home. I was exhausted but content, like we were finally starting this new chapter in our lives. I was in the bedroom, putting some clothes in the closet, trying to at least get our room set up before my husband arrived. It felt nice to make a bit of progress, even though the rest of the house was still a total maze of boxes. I was completely lost in what I was doing when, suddenly, the doorbell rang. At first, I thought it might be my husband showing up early, even though I'd just talked to him, and he hadn't mentioned anything about coming tonight. Still, I went to the door, a little curious. I opened it, and there was a woman standing there, holding a covered dish and smiling warmly. She looked like she was in her mid-30s, maybe a little bit older, with this friendly, down-to-earth vibe that put me at ease right away. "Welcome to the neighborhood," she said, holding out the dish with a warm smile. "I wasn't around when you arrived, so I thought I'd stop by, say hello, and bring a little something to welcome you. I'm from down the street, a couple of houses over." The woman was so nice that I completely forgot my manners and just left her standing in the doorway. I quickly stepped aside and said, "Oh, I'm so sorry. Please come in. It's been a long day and I just wasn't expecting any visitors." I gave a tired smile as she walked in, carrying the dish. The house was mostly bare, boxes stacked along the walls, and I awkwardly brushed aside some packing materials from the sofa to give her a spot to sit. "Thank you so much for this," I said, gesturing to the dish. "I didn't even think about dinner with all the unpacking, so this is really thoughtful." As she set the dish down, she smiled and said, "I figured you'd be too busy with all the unpacking to even think about dinner." We chatted for a bit. She admired the house, saying how beautiful it was, and even made a little tour around it, complimenting each room. She mentioned she was a widow and lived alone a few houses down, then helped me get the table ready for dinner, almost like we'd been friends for years. The casserole smelled amazing, homemade and comforting. We sat down, but as we ate, her conversation started getting strange. She'd laugh at things that weren't funny, and then, almost too casually, ask, "So, when's your husband supposed to be home? And do you have security cameras set up around here yet?" The questions kept coming, one after another, to the point where I started feeling overwhelmed, like she was throwing too much at me all at once. When I gave her a confused look, she shrugged and said, "Oh, it's just good to have them, even in safe neighborhoods like this, just in case. You never know." Her tone was light, but something about it made me feel uneasy. Then she leaned in, her expression turning serious, almost intense. "You and your husband must be doing quite well to afford a place like this," she said, her eyes lingering on me in a way that felt unsettling. Caught off guard, I managed a nervous smile and said, "We've been working hard for a long time, so it's nice to finally settle somewhere we really love." I tried to keep it vague, hoping to steer the conversation away from anything too personal. I started feeling uncomfortable with where the conversation was going, and all I wanted was to get her out of my house. Her whole vibe had shifted from this friendly, down-to-earth neighbor to someone way too interested in my personal life. Halfway through the meal, I started feeling dizzy, like I just hit a wall of exhaustion. Maybe I'd pushed myself too hard today with all the unpacking and setting things up. "Are you okay, honey?" The way she said it had this mocking edge, like she was amused by how I was struggling to stay focused. I forced a nod, managing a weak, "Yeah, just exhausted, I guess." But my words felt sluggish, like they were slipping away from me. "You know, houses like this usually have a basement," she said, almost too casually. "Do you have one here?" The question hit me like a cold wave. Something about it felt completely off, like a red flag I'd been ignoring suddenly smacking me in the face. My stomach twisted, and I forced a weak smile, trying to hide how uncomfortable I was. But by then, I was already starting to feel dizzy, my vision blurring around the edges. I tried to get up, but my legs felt weak, heavy, like they were sinking into the floor. I stumbled, grabbing the edge of the table, looking at her in shock. The room started to spin, and that's when it hit me. She'd put something in the food. But by the time I realized, it was already too late. The last thing I saw was her twisted smile hovering above me before everything went black. When I woke up, everything was dark, and I couldn't move. My wrists and ankles were tied tight, biting into my skin, and something was gagging me, pressing against my mouth. The air was cold and damp, and I was sitting on a chair in the middle of what I realized was the basement. My basement. My head was throbbing, and I felt like I was still half in a dream, trying to piece together how the hell I ended up here. As my eyes adjusted, all I could see was the faint outline of the stairs leading up to the door, barely visible. Every sound seemed amplified, the creak of the pipes, my own shaky breaths. Panic started to claw its way up my throat. The woman. She drugged me, and now I was trapped here, alone, tied up and completely helpless. And my husband wouldn't even know anything was wrong until tomorrow. No one would. Suddenly, the door at the top of the stairs opened, and light flooded down, making me squint. There she was, coming down the stairs slowly, with this calm expression on her face, like she'd done this 100 times before. In her hands, she was carrying my safe box, our safe box. Everything valuable we owned was in there. My jewelry, the money we'd stashed, our passports, every important document we had. She stopped in front of me, holding up the safe like it was a trophy. "Now," she said, her voice steady. "Why don't you give me the passcode?" I stared at her, my heart pounding. I shook my head, refusing. There was no way I was going to hand over everything we had. Her face twisted, and she crouched down in front of me, her tone suddenly dark. "I've got all the time in the world, and there are plenty of ways to make you talk. We can sit here all day if that's what you want. I can make this hurt, believe me." Her calmness was terrifying, sending chills down my spine. At that moment, it hit me. She was actually capable of hurting me. This wasn't just talk. She was serious. The whole thing felt surreal, like some twisted nightmare you only see in movies, scenes you never think will happen in real life. But here I was, living it, completely trapped. No one was coming to save me, and she knew it. I nodded, signaling that I'd give her the passcode. She straightened up and pulled the gag from my mouth. Defeated, I whispered the passcode, barely able to get the words out. Tears were streaming down my face as I started begging, my voice shaky and desperate. "Please, take whatever you want. I swear, I won't tell anyone. Just, please let me go." But her expression didn't change. She just shoved the gag back into my mouth, gave me one last indifferent look, and then turned and walked away, her footsteps echoing up the stairs. The door closed behind her, and I heard the lock click into place, leaving me alone in the thick, suffocating silence. I was alone in the basement for hours, the cold seeping into my skin, settling deep into my bones as I sat there, bound and helpless. My mind raced, desperate to find a way out, but every thought kept circling back to the same terrifying truth. There was nothing I could do. I twisted my wrists against the ropes, feeling them bite deeper into my skin. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't break free. Every pull, every struggle just sent more pain shooting up my arms, the skin raw and stinging. Hours passed, though I completely lost track of time in that darkness. Every minute felt like an eternity, stretching out in this endless silence broken only by my own shallow breaths. My only hope was my husband, who'd promised he'd be there early in the morning. I kept clinging to that, replaying his words in my mind. I just had to hold on a little longer, wait for him to come, to realize something was off, to come looking for me. Until then, I was trapped in the dark, the ache in my wrists growing sharper with every useless attempt to free myself. At some point, I must have passed out because the next thing I remember was someone shaking me awake. It was my husband. He'd found me, his face full of panic and confusion as he kept asking what happened. His voice sounded distant, like he was calling to me from underwater. I didn't have the strength to explain, my voice barely audible. He helped me upstairs, and once I was in a better condition, I told him everything, about the woman, the dinner, how she drugged me, tied me up, and left me here. He listened, his face going pale as he took it all in, and without wasting a second, he pulled out his phone to call the police. When the police arrived, they searched the house and questioned me about the woman, what she looked like, how she spoke, every little detail I could remember. But when they asked around the neighborhood, it only got stranger. No one matched her description. In fact, no one in the area had ever seen her before, and she certainly didn't live in the neighborhood. She was just gone, like she'd never existed, leaving behind only the nightmare she'd put me through. It wasn't even the woman herself that scared me the most. It was those endless hours in the basement, tied up and alone, dragging by as I held on to the hope that my husband would come and save me. The worst fear was that no one would come, that I'd die there, and no one would ever know. Even now, it feels unreal. I can't shake the memory of that cold basement, the ropes digging into my skin, her mocking smile as she watched me struggle. The police never found her, and things were even harder because we hadn't set up any security cameras yet. It was like she knew that too, mocking me with her little speech about having security just in case. I can't help but wonder if she's out there somewhere, doing the same thing to someone else, waiting, watching, finding her next target.